work to defend this. This is for the American people, and I think that they deserve to be rewarded. They work hard, they play by the rules. No one should be crushed by unfair rules. So I yield back my time. Thank you very much.
I thank the gentlelady from California. The story that Congresswoman Eshoo told is making very real what the consequences are of taking away from families benefits that they have and now depend on. Just a quick story about Vermont to make it, again, real. A woman by the name of Donna from Plainfield, Vermont, hard-working person. She and her husband both work. Their young son graduated from school, got an entry-level job. It paid $8 or $9 an hour. And as is the case with most entry-level jobs, it came without health care. That child was no longer eligible to stay on his parents' policy. And they were doing all they could to pay their bills. Health care is expensive. They couldn't afford to buy a separate policy for their son. And most of the time that works out, but sometimes it doesn't. And it didn't in this case. Their son had a car accident, $20,000 in medical bills. They're still paying those bills off. When we passed the health care bill that included the provision that sons and daughters who are starting out in life, taking that first job, usually without health care, but learning job skills, fiscal discipline, personal responsibility, the bill we passed allowed those kids to stay on our policies until age 26. It makes an enormous amount of sense in what peace of mind it provided. That assurance to Donna relieved her and her husband and their son of all this anxiety about whether they'd have the health care they needed in the event of an accident. The action today by this Congress, led by the new majority, takes away from Donna and her husband and her son their access to affordable health care. It didn't need to be done. And the question I think all of us have to ask is why. You know, there are elements of the health care bill that are imperfect. Let's improve them. There are elements that are very controversial. The individual mandate, it's controversial and we have to acknowledge it. I supported it and I'll tell you why. I believe that if everybody is going to have access to health care, and the vast majority of this country believe that's the case, then all of us should share in the responsibility of paying for it on the ability to pay. That's why I supported the individual mandate, because folks who don't have insurance don't go forever without having the need for health care services. And most states are like Vermont. Somebody gets hit by a truck, the rescue squad shows up, and they take that person to the hospital, and the hospital may inquire about insurance, but they don't condition providing full and extensive care on whether that person has insurance or doesn't. And that cost gets shifted onto the taxpayer. That cost gets shifted onto those who do have insurance in the form of higher premiums. So this is real, what happened. The consequences to families are real. I'd like to yield to the member from New York, also a leader on health care, Congresswoman Clark. Thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Peter Welch. Mr. Speaker, you know, I just find it so interesting that here we are in the new 112th Congress, and in the wealthiest nation on the planet, where nearly 50 million Americans still lack health care insurance, 13.5% of which are New Yorkers. Last year alone, New York City's hospitals spent $1.2 billion in charity costs. You see, in a city like New York, we're going to make sure that at the moment that people are most vulnerable in an emergency, they're able to receive health care. But it's cost us $1.2 billion in charity costs. Tragically, people who are either uninsured or underinsured often have to go without the vital health care services they need simply because they can't afford it. Every American has a human right to adequate physical and mental health care, and I believe that government has a responsibility to assist its citizens in securing quality health care. That's why I've been such a fervent supporter of the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act, which passed the 111th Congress, because it does just that. It ensures that Americans have access to quality health care, and it makes sure that we begin an enlightened process of preventive care, which is the least expensive way of us being able to meet our health care needs. You know, repealing this bill would mean that insurance companies will once again be able to drop coverage for people when they're ill, exactly when they need that coverage the most. It will mean that kids with pre-existing conditions will be denied coverage once again. It will mean that insurance companies would again be able to impose devastating annual and lifetime caps. And it would mean that young people will no longer be able to stay on their parents' plan until the age of 26. It would mean that pregnant women would be denied coverage simply because they are pregnant, since pregnancy is considered a pre-existing condition and therefore a basis for denial of coverage. And finally, our seniors who have faced an increase in their prescription drug costs because they would be thrown back into the Medicare Part D donut hole, which the health care reform law would close by 2020. You know, with all that has been discussed about the virtues of health care reform, all that is already being implemented and a part of the health care packages of constituents in my district, people are recognizing how earth-shaking and groundbreaking this legislation has been. I'd like to share with you a letter that I received from one of my constituents in the 11th Congressional District, and his name is Jonathan. He says, "Congresswoman Clark, I am a two-time cancer survivor. I'm constantly worrying about being denied coverage because of my pre-existing condition. I'm not comfortable that corporations under the old rules would have considered me unprofitable. I think it's a disgrace that this problem has existed in our country. I, for one, will move to Canada or elsewhere if health care reform is repealed and if I ever have a reoccurrence of my cancer. Meanwhile, I think it's every American's responsibility not to allow other people with pre-existing conditions to be denied coverage." You see, Jonathan is not just thinking about himself. He recognizes that, like himself, there are millions of Americans across this country who may not have options of mobility to leave the country to seek health care, but who need this legislation to go into full effect. And that's what we are here discussing today. The essence of what this legislation means for Americans across this nation. You know, one thing about health care insurance, you often don't know what you need until you need it. And because there are individuals in our civil society, and many have referred to them as the invincibles, young people who, you know, are young, vital, physically fit, one tends to look after their health care after the fact. Well, we want to do a paradigm shift in this nation where it brings down the cost of health care insurance. That means that every year we go through an annual physical. We know how our body is operating, and we're clear on that. And if by chance we develop disease or we're in a catastrophic accident of some sort, we have the coverage that will not allow us to go into bankruptcy. That's all that any family could truly ask for, and that's what we congratulate the last Congress on accomplishing. What was displayed here today really was not forward-leaning or forward-thinking, and it's our hope that the Senate won't even take this up. Because right now, we're hearing from seniors who are saying already we're looking forward to the support we can get for the prescription drugs that we need to address our chronic disease. So, as Jonathan noted in his letter to me, this repeal would once again allow big insurance companies who are only focused on profitability to deny coverage to him and so many others with pre-existing conditions. I don't think we're going to allow Jonathan to be punished and deny coverage simply because he's a cancer survivor. And that's what repealing this health care law would do. So I want to thank my colleagues for promoting this special order today and making sure that our voices are heard and the voices of our constituents are heard who are really in favor of this legislation, this law of the land actually going into full maturity. Because as this law matures, more and more Americans will be covered, their families will be more secure, and we will be all the more healthier for it as a civil society. I want to thank the gentleman from Vermont, Peter Welsh, for anchoring this special order this evening, and yield back to Peter for the rest of the special order.
I want to thank the member from New York. You know, you talked very eloquently about pre-existing conditions. And who of us doesn't have one? There was an article in the Washington Post today that said about 65% of Americans have pre-existing conditions. So if the insurance companies are able to deny people coverage on that basis, it's a tremendous business model for them. They insure folks who are healthy. That's great for the shareholders, but it doesn't do much for most of us, the majority of Americans who have a pre-existing condition. So thank you for focusing on that real provision in the bill. I'm going to yield in a moment to the member from Maryland. We've got a number of members here, so maybe we can be interactive. But one of the things that I was going to ask you was on this question of preventive care. When we were considering this bill, I called Tom Eubner, who is the administrator of a local hospital, the Rutland Regional Medical Center, and he had a lot of reservations about the health care bill. Whether on balance it was good or bad, he decided on balance it was good. But one of the things he said very specifically was that the free preventive care for seniors is absolutely essential. It was essential for their good health, and it was essential for bending the cost curve, because folks do not come in if they don't have the way to pay for it. That was him talking to me, telling me about the Rutland population. And I just, whatever your remarks are, member from Maryland, I'm wondering if that's consistent with experiences that you've had in your district.
Well, I thank the gentleman. I think that's right. You look at so many things that can be prevented if only people were able to get their preventive care. And today, what we did in this House, what the majority did in this House, is so sad. Taking away the ability of senior citizens to go in for an annual checkup and make that early discovery and diagnosis of diabetes or hypertension or any of the markers for those chronic illnesses that, if treated early, could actually save all of us a lot of money, all of those seniors a lot of grief, and really be good for the system. And so I think when I think about what we did today, I think of the millions of Americans all across this country who every day are discovering a new benefit that's now available to them because of the new health care law. And I think it's important for us to remind the American public that the Affordable Care Act isn't a bill, it isn't an idea, it's not a proposal, it's the law. And today the law is that if you are up to age 26, that you can stay on your parents' health insurance plan. The law of the land today is that if you're a senior and you're paying out-of-pocket costs to the thousands of dollars for your prescription drugs, that those drugs that fall in that prescription drug donut hole, you will receive a 50% discount on those drugs. The law of the land is that you can't be excluded for pre-existing conditions. Now, the gentleman from Vermont talked about pre-existing conditions, as did the gentlewoman from California. And it's so simple. That's true, almost not a one of us without a pre-existing condition. Well, the law of the land despite the sadness that happened in this House today, is that if you have a pre-existing condition and you are under age 18, that you will actually be able to receive health care benefits, insurance for that. And as we go through implementation, that you will be able to, whatever your age and a pre-existing condition, you won't be excluded from receiving your health care. The law of the land today is that small businesses receive a tax credit for providing health care to their employees. 35% last year when the law was started, 50% this year. That's the law of the land. And so I think I'm glad to be here with our colleagues, and I don't want to overplay the sadness that happened in this House today, because there was a lot of business about taking care of campaign promises and meeting artificial goals. But the fact is that last year we passed a health care law. It's being implemented right now, and that's the law of the land. And thank goodness for the millions of people all across this country that have the security in knowing that not only do they have access to quality, affordable health care, but that applies all across this country. And with that,
will the gentlelady yield on that point?
I will.
If I could just point out something, you know, a lot of people look at this through the lens of their personal experience, and perhaps people watching here say, you know what, I've got health insurance. I like my health insurance. I don't have a pre-existing condition. Why should I really care about those people that do? Well, I think you understand this, but I think many of our Republican colleagues don't. We wind up paying as citizens one way or the other.
Right.
You know, we had a while ago this H1N1 flu outbreak. Now, if someone has the choice and health insurance coverage that allows them to go get a regular checkup and get doctor screenings and get perhaps medication, given the idea of what they should do to treat that, is it better or worse than that they don't have insurance and they get on the bus in the morning and they wind up at a hospital emergency room and take you and your kids with them? The fact is, it's not whether we're going to pay for health care, it's how we do it most efficiently. And my Republican colleagues don't seem to understand this very basic idea that they talk about, you know, we should have choice. Nobody chooses to be born with cystic fibrosis. No one chooses to have a child that's born with asthma. And I don't care how much you believe in the free market. When God strikes you with those afflictions and you need care, the only question then becomes, how do we provide that care that's most efficient? Right now, if people don't have insurance and they fall down or they get hit by a bus, God forbid, and they don't have the ability to pay, it's not as if there is some magical force out there that absorbs those costs. We wind up paying it. Everyone who has a health insurance policy winds up paying it. We in New York, and Congresswoman Clark made the point about New York, we pay $8 billion in additional taxes. So it's just a matter of how we do it, and it comes down to a very simple idea. It's less expensive to give people a subsidy so they can buy insurance than it is to pay for them in an emergency room. It's just cheaper that way. So it's just a matter of how we choose to do it. And I think when you point out the fairness and the decency as Americans that we have when we provide the care, it's also doing a favor for everyone that has insurance and every taxpayer in this country. So even if you don't buy into the idea that we should be altruistic, and we fundamentally believe, I believe this is a fundamental difference between the parties. We don't believe that you can get too far ahead as a country when you have so many 30-some-odd million people without health insurance. We don't believe you fundamentally can. More people taking time off from work. Every single product we buy has more cost because of our health care failures. That's the difference between Democrats and Republicans. We believe those things out of a sense of compassion. But even if you just look at the economic bottom line, you should want to provide people with preventative care. It makes the most sense. It saves us money. It saves every American that has insurance money. And I want to thank you for pointing those things out.
Well, I thank the gentleman, and I'm going to finish up here because I know that we have other members who want to speak on this really important issue. And I just want to say in closing, today I began with a story of a young woman who's very close to me. Her name is Annie. Annie is such a delight. Well, in the spring she was diagnosed with leukemia. She'll be 28 years old in February. And when she was diagnosed, fortunately, she had health insurance. But what she realized and her family realized right away is that very quickly, as she was approaching trying to get a bone marrow transplant and all of the attendant costs that are associated with that, is that without the change that we made in the health care law, she would actually, maybe her parents would have to give up their retirement funds. Maybe they would have to sacrifice their home because they wanted to save their daughter's life, because she would have bumped up against those lifetime limits. And so what we did in the 111th Congress in passing a health care law is we said to young people like 28-year-old Annie that we're committed to making sure that she has the ability to take care of her health and to save her life. That's what this is about. It's about real people, it's about their lives, and it's about our obligation that we have to one another. And with that, I would yield. And I thank the gentleman for organizing us this evening.
Thank the gentlewoman from Maryland. May I inquire as to the amount of time available?
28 minutes.
Okay, thank you. In order that we can allow all members to speak, I'm going to yield 5 minutes to my colleague from Texas. But if there is any inquiries by members who are present and want to engage in a dialogue, I encourage you to do that. And I yield 5 minutes to my colleague.
Well, I thank the gentleman from Vermont, and I'm just very pleased to have heard my good friends, plural, from New York, Ms. Clark, Ms. Weiner, and other members who are here, and good friend from Maryland. I hope this is a comforting special order, because even as we speak, I think it is enormously important, because people look at this and they saw a debate, they saw a vote, and now we're here on the floor of the House. I want them to know that this bill is the law of the land. And what we're trying to explain to them is the potential devastation of that bill being repealed. The good news is that this was a payback to those who voted for my good friends on the other side of the aisle, Republicans, and we understand that. But lives are involved. To the distinguished gentleman from Vermont, lives are actually involved. So I just have a few points that I want to characterize this debate as, and to give people comfort that we are still fighting for this law. This law is in place. And right now, the elimination of lifetime caps, you can still use this bill. The idea that seniors, some 40 million of them, beginning in January 2011, will begin receiving savings on preventative care services, you can still use this. This is very important. The 50% discount, if anybody had an earful for their seniors, it was the donut hole. Every senior citizen center you go to, they're talking about the choices I have to make between food and rent and prescription drugs. I want them to know the law is still in place. I know there was a debate on the floor of the House. I know there was a vote, but it should be well known that Democrats put up an able fight, but more importantly, we know that our President will be working to preserve the law that exists. That's very important. Having listened to a gentleman by the name of Ed, first name Ed, who is a chronic victim or a chronic disease person who has a chronic disease, I might say, hemophilia, told a very important story, how he and his brother grew up with that, how he lives well today because of the fact that we have passed the elimination of lifetime caps. And so he can be treated, he can work, he has insurance. And that's why the question is, when people say, how does this impact me? Those of you who have insurance, we're not taking it away from you, but I can assure you, you had lifetime caps. And what about the young woman and her son that came to my town hall meeting, who said, in tears, Congresswoman, Sheila, whatever they call me, we had insurance. We went to a doctor for a physical for my son, who had to get a physical to go into school. Every child has to get a physical at the beginning of the school year. And the doctor turned me away and said, your insurance only covers emergency room. We won't have those kinds of half-baked insurance anymore. So I quickly want to do this, Mr. Welch. There was a big discussion about the constitutionality of this bill. And I got into another big discussion with with one of our wonderful pundits who wanted to argue about whether someone would die without this health insurance. This is a Medicare patient or someone who is using Medicare, excuse me. It indicates that she spent the week of New Year's of 2008 in an emergency room and then confined to her home for weeks because she developed pneumonia. She says she has never been so sick in her life. But the good news was, in 2008, she had a government-run health care provision, Medicare program, that allowed her to discover her sickness and to be treated. Her very words, "For a time I was so sick I was afraid I was going to die. Then I was so sick I was afraid I wouldn't, and I was miserable." But the real question is, even though she's a senior, this government-run program allowed her to get care, and she didn't die. And sometimes walking pneumonia, everyone knows, is not anything to play around with. Why my friends on the other side of the aisle are complaining about a government-run program, this program has not been ruled unconstitutional, and it has been in place since 1965. So when they make the argument and it frightens our seniors who are listening and they're saying, this vote, do we not have it? You have Medicare. We are enhancing Medicare. We're making it solvent. 2037. This is what this bill will do for you. And then let me just conclude with this. This is probably not readable, but this is my state celebrating the bill. This is the Texas Department of Insurance that has just put out a report celebrating all of the provisions of this bill that will help the millions of uninsured. You all know that Texas has the highest number of uninsured in the nation. We are obviously a growing state, highest number. This is not a Democratic Texas Department of Insurance, and I only say that to say other states are doing the same. Monies are now flowing to states to ease the burden of health care. So I don't know what my friends on the other side of the aisle were doing when states are receiving money now, when people have no more lifetime caps, when young people can be on their parents' insurance because of the issue of being 26 years old. And then this legal argument, and this is the conclusion because I carried this book around, the Commerce Clause has covered our health bills or a number of federal provisions that we've used, and we have not seen them overturned. We haven't seen Medicare overturned. But there's another element that I think raises a question for my colleagues, and I hope that those who are now in the courts on this bill, and it is the courts that make a determination of the constitutionality, not this Congress, not people who are responding to a campaign or a promise they made, but I think they'd have to look at the question of the 14th Amendment and equal protection of the law. Does that mean that those who either can only pay a certain amount and get a low-caliber insurance and be taken advantage of, or does it mean that small businesses who would like to provide insurance for their employees don't have a right to some form of equal protection of the law? We thought about that. That's what this bill does. It helps equalize access to health care, quality health care. And the Fifth Amendment clearly states that no one can deprive you of life or liberty or property. So there are a lot of provisions that I think are meritorious in any argument to suggest that this is an unconstitutional act that we did. We equalized the playing field as opposed to depriving people of the equal playing field. So I thank the gentleman for having this. There's a whole bunch of items that we can comment on, but every state is benefiting. Every district is benefiting. And how my friends could vote against actual direct benefits where the people in their state are jumping for joy because this bill is in place and it is the law of the land. Let it be very clear, it is the law of the land. And I yield back to the gentleman.
I thank the gentlelady. And the example you gave of Texas, where the authorities who have responsibility for health care are pushing ahead to take advantage of the provisions that will allow them to do their job better, even as we're having this debate about repealing and unwinding, but not replacing. I mean, the point is that if you want to improve something, you know, that's our job.
Absolutely.
Let's do it. And there are provisions that all of us who supported this bill know we know they could be improved, but we're hearing now real-world stories about things that are working really well, and we want to keep them. May I inquire as to the time available?
19 minutes.
19. I'm going to yield to the gentleman from Connecticut who has played a major role, especially in making this financing of this health care be fair, in not doubly taxing folks who are getting employer-sponsored health care benefits, and also for your tremendous work on seniors. The gentleman from Connecticut, Mr. Courtney.
Thank you, Mr. Welch. And actually, following on the Congresswoman's comments about Texas's participation in various parts of the program, I wanted to focus for a minute on one of the really strong pro-employer provisions of this bill. Again, we heard a lot of talk on the floor today about job-killing health care laws. I mean, the fact of the matter is, since President Obama signed the measure into law in March, over 1 million private sector jobs have been created in this country. I would contrast that to the day he was sworn into office, January of 2009, where the U.S. economy lost 800,000 jobs in 1 month alone. So clearly, you know, on just a simple data basis, this claim really doesn't pass the test of the facts. But one of the pro-employer measures, which Texas is now participating in, along with the other 49 states, is a provision called the Early Retiree Reinsurance Program. Again, in 1986, over 60% of America's employers had a retiree health insurance plan, so that people hitting age 55 or 60 could retire and their benefits would be extended. In 2009, that number had fallen to below 30%. What this bill did is it created a reinsurance fund, which is like a government backstop for private employment-based health insurance plans, similar to the same type of reinsurance plans that we have for terrorism insurance, flood insurance, the nuclear energy industry. Again, these are types of property and casualty coverage which would never be written in this country if the government did not act as a backstop. We set up a similar fund and basically opened the doors to employers across America who had, again, employees who are over age 55. And what have we seen? Over 4,700 employers have enrolled in this program. Over half of the Fortune 500 companies in America have signed up for this program. I mean, you just go down the list: GE, General Dynamics, Coca-Cola, Pepsi, AT&T, Comcast, Ford, GM, Walgreens. Again, the list goes on and on. Again, all 50 states have enrolled for their state employee health plans, including states that are suing the federal government to try and blow this law to smithereens. And the fact of the matter is that, you know, this is, they're voting with their feet in terms of whether or not this is a good law or not. If this was not a good program, they wouldn't enroll in it. But they understand that stabilizing early retiree health benefits is a way of making sure that people who are 55 years old and are teaching, or police officers, or working in corporate America are going to retire. And that will create elasticity in the labor market so that young Americans can actually fill those positions. I mean, this is even truer in terms of physical labor occupations. And again, Taft-Hartley plans, laborers, iron workers have all signed up for this reinsurance program, again, as a way of stabilizing 55 to 65-year-old Americans' health benefits and creating more opportunities for younger Americans so that people will follow that natural path of retiring. When you take that measure and combine it with the small business tax credit, $40 billion of tax relief for small employers, this is a pro-jobs, pro-employer law. And again, quick example, I was at a roundtable on health care in my district. There was a family doctor that was there who was talking about the new Medicare changes and how excited she was about you know, getting tools to better serve her clients. And she's like, God, I'm getting killed on my own employee health plan. It's like $14,000 a year for, you know, 4 or 5 employees. And I said, well, did you check out the small business tax credit? The small business what? So she went on that tax calculator at smallbusinessmajority.org, called me back a couple days later. She's going to save $4,000 on her health insurance premium because of that tax credit. By passing this law today, the Republican majority raised the taxes of small businesses all across America at exactly the same time that today they are figuring out their tax returns for 2010. I was a small employer before I came to Congress a short time ago. That's what you do in January and February. You start pulling your papers together to do your taxes. And they just voted today to blow up that tax credit to help the real job creators in America's economy. I know the young...
Just a quick point. Number one, is the benefit you just mentioned in a state like Texas, this retiree program, and we have a very quixotic or very complicated retirement program for teachers. But number one, and I would just say in closing, state legislatures are beginning to go back to their capitals to try to understand how they're going to face these enormous deficits. I can't understand why we are burdening now states by this vote with extra responsibilities when they're all in crisis. The bill we have saves jobs, creates jobs, and provides benefits for people who need it, and states who are in trouble.
And quickly to conclude, I mean, I'm glad you mentioned teachers because, you know, as we now begin a great debate in our country about trying to reform America's schools, the one thing I think everybody agrees is getting young teachers who understand technology, who are enthusiastic, that young students can identify with a little better than some of the older teachers that are in the classroom. We want them in the classrooms. But older teachers who are afraid that they're going to lose their benefits if they retire are going to continue to work for their benefits. And this fund, this reinsurance fund, is a way of trying to loosen the labor market and get new blood all across in occupations all across our economy. Thank Mr. Welch for your great presentation.
I thank the gentleman from Connecticut, and as I listened, it's a good news, bad news story. The good news is businesses, large businesses and small, that have fiduciary responsibility to their shareholders and to their employees have sharp pencils and figure out what makes the most sense for them. And they're signing up for this. So that's an indication that they've kicked the tires, come to the conclusion that this is good for business. The bad news is we apparently have done a pretty lousy job explaining this to the American people. And it's gotten obscured with the epithet of, quote, Obamacare. But when you peel away the specifics of this, and then you provided evidence that businesses that have to make a hard-nosed decision, this ain't about doing, quote, a good thing, they want to do the right thing for their company, but they've decided this is the prudent fiscal thing. So I thank you. And I yield to the gentleman from Virginia, senior member of the Appropriations Committee, and one of the members who's always a voice of conviction and conscience in this institution, Mr. Moran.
I thank my very good friend from Vermont for yielding to me, and I thank my colleagues for participating in this discussion. There are so many things that are hard to understand with regard to what occurred today. One is that the new Republican majority tells us that jobs is their first priority. This will generate about 4 million jobs around the country, we're told, and we can identify where they occur. And so we won't create those jobs, particularly in the healthcare professions. We're told that another high priority, of course, is to reduce the budget deficit. Nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office tells us that this will save more than $1 trillion through an emphasis on preventive care, by getting people out of the most expensive emergency care and into a doctor's offices and much more efficient delivery of care. But nevertheless, we won't save that money. We won't create those jobs. One of the fascinating things is that I'm told by many of my friends on the Republican side that they actually agree in eliminating the insurance company's ability to deny people due to pre-existing conditions. It's just that they're opposed to the individual mandate because it's unconstitutional. Well, the fact is you can't have one without the other. Imagine how our car insurance system would work. You have to have car insurance, but there's no mandate. So just wait until you get into a crash, then go to the hospital, go to your insurance company, they're going to have to pay it out. I guess they think that's the way the health insurance system would work. Wait till you get sick, wait till you have an accident, go to your insurance company, get your insurance coverage, they'll pay for it. Obviously, they won't pay for it because every insurance company would go out of business. And so if you had pre-existing conditions without individual mandate, then it's the federal government that would have to provide health care to everyone when they got sick or when they had an accident. Because certainly no private insurance company would ever think of putting themselves in that position. So you can't have one without the other. It doesn't make sense. But to my very good friend from Vermont who gave us the opportunity to share a few comments tonight after this historic vote, the thing that troubles me the most, that I can't get my mind around, is that before we took that vote to repeal health care reform, every single Republican member of this Congress voted to say, I want my federal employees' health benefits plan, I want my insurance coverage, and then they went ahead and every single one of them voted against providing the same sort of coverage to their constituents. That's what the recommittal was. I don't know how many of them read it. You know, they're always complaining, well, we didn't have a chance to read it. Well, it was as simple as could be. If you're going to vote against providing health insurance coverage for your constituents, then don't take it for yourself because it's basically the same plan. But every single one of them, old and new members alike, voted to give themselves that very plan that they then turned around and voted against making available to their constituents. So this may have been one of the most hypocritical days in the history of the United States Congress. I don't know how they explain it. I don't know how I would explain it if I had to go back home. Sorry about that. I took care of myself in one vote, the very first vote of this brand new Congress, and then I voted to do just the opposite for you in the very next vote. Boy, we're off to a very interesting start. I thank my friend for giving us the opportunity to share that with the American people. Thank you.
Well, I thank the gentleman from Virginia. And I yield now to the gentleman from New York, Mr. Tonko, who has been listening to his constituents in the Albany region and hearing from them about prescription drug pricing and how it's too high. He's been bringing practical solutions to Congress to try to help make health care more affordable. The gentleman from New York.
Thank you, Representative. Pleasure to join with our colleagues from Virginia and Connecticut and Texas and Vermont, my neighbor to the immediate east. So thank you for your outstanding work in this capacity. There's nothing more powerful than the faces that put a real-life meaning into the work that we've done here. Let me talk about a constituent, actually a family of constituents from Albany, New York. Elena Young is a very young mom and has a one-year-old son, Lee. And she's a three-time cancer survivor. There's a history of cancer in her family. And in the latter half of 2009, her husband, Bill, testified at our health care forum because his wife was having complications with her pregnancy and required bed rest. Well, as you can imagine, with pre-existing conditions, she was in and out of insurance coverage and very often was struggling to find ways that they could get the family covered. Her pre-existing condition complicated that severely. The way she found health care coverage was as a PhD student hooking herself and her family to the university plan. They were thrilled about the news of the pregnancy. She was in remission. They had all this hope going for them. She then developed complications with her pregnancy, situations with malnutrition, iron deficiency, severe iron deficiency, and yes, even blood clots, all of which were life-threatening. Well, you talk about the pharmaceutical needs. She was given prescriptions for 10 different medications, all of which were very important. Representative Welch, she had to choose 5 of the 10. She tried to pick the 5 most important, and even then, it was an out-of-pocket expenditure of $1,000 a month so that she could stay well and stay alive during this pregnancy. And what made it very difficult as she was working through all of this was that because of the complications of this pregnancy, her doctors told her that she would need to undergo a C-section. So now the family is faced with a decision. Do I quit at school, where I was earning an income, and keep my coverage, or what is my other choice? Because in order to have the surgery, which was going to save her pregnancy and her life, she had to take time off from school, so fell out of the ranks of the insured. Now, let me just quote from Elena. As she and her husband debated applying for more student loans or a new credit card, she had this to say: I needed a procedure to save both my life and the life of my baby, and I was choosing between interest rates. Is that not a powerful statement? And this is what this reform is all about, and why it is so aggravating to see the repeal voted on here in this chamber today. Because the hope that was brought by our bill, applied to a case like that of the Young family, is a very, very powerful statement. The Affordable Care Act bans both annual and lifetime expenditure caps. And that health coverage that is limited annually or lifetime is very disrupting and can deny, when you most need health care, it can deny the coverage. And so, with all of this outcome, here's a real-life example where this family, with their one-year-old child, had to struggle to find the insurance coverage. But why are we putting people through this sort of difficulty? And this is not unusual. It's a powerful story, but there are countless episodes, anecdotes that are brought to everyone's attention on this floor. And we're here to be leaders that provide hope and opportunity for the people we represent. And then to repeal progress just as it begins to reach the very households that we have addressed across this land is a very sad statement. And we have to continue to work to make certain that the beneficiaries, the millions of people who prospered from this sort of activity, are not let down. I think this is a very important time in our nation's history for us to use our resources wisely, to respond to the constituents with compassion, and to understand that these real-life stories are exactly that, real and profound and deep and meaningful. And they ought to help us decipher what the best policies are. And I really thank Elena and Bill and Leave for the opportunity to share their story. It's a painful story, and they're very generous to allow us to share it here on this floor. And I thank you again for bringing us together. The pre-existing conditions, the annual and lifetime caps, the filling the donut hole for our nation's seniors so that they can, move forward and live comfortably and maybe even save their lives with the appropriate medication, and affordability, accessibility. These are all the dynamics for which we have fought, and it's a shame that they're being taken away or attempted to be taken away at a time when they're just beginning to have their presence felt. And I thank you for bringing us together tonight.
Does the gentleman yield back?
I will. I
thank the gentleman. How much time do we have?
Time has expired.
In that case, I yield back, and I thank my colleagues for joining us for this hour tonight.
Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 5th, 2011, the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Smith, is recognized for 60 minutes as the designee of the Majority Leader.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it is my privilege, distinct privilege, to yield to Martha Roby, a new member who was just elected. I would like to choose an outstanding pro-life woman, a member of Congress, and we're just so pleased to have her in the caucus.
Thank you so much. Mr. Speaker, 2 weeks ago, I took part in a reading of the U.S. Constitution in this chamber. It was a fitting tribute to the great social contract between the American people and our government. The Constitution is an exceptional document, and we have all taken an oath to defend it, and defend it we must. Too often, our Constitution is under attack by the liberal activist movement that seeks to achieve through the courts that which they cannot achieve at the ballot box. On the front line are the unelected judges that disregard the words and meaning of the Constitution in favor of their own political and social views. They decide cases not on law and the facts, but on the outcome that they alone believe to be the best policy. Roe v. Wade is an example of this sort of judicial activism at its worst. Together with other cases, the Roe Court created a fundamental right to abortion, even though a simple reading of the Constitution reveals no such right. As a result, unimaginable harm has occurred. In the short time that I have talked tonight, another baby has been aborted. That equals 1 abortion every 2 minutes, 3,300 abortions a day, or 1.2 million abortions a year. Mr. Speaker, I am unapologetically pro-life. I believe that the miracle of human life begins at conception. I believe that we are fearfully and wonderfully made, knit together by God in our mother's womb. I believe that every American is entitled to basic human rights, and I believe that I have an obligation to do everything I can to fight for the unborn, to prevent taxpayer money from funding abortions, and to protect our democratic system for the encroachment of an all-powerful judiciary. Let us use this 38th anniversary of Roe v. Wade as an occasion to reaffirm our beliefs and redirect ourselves to that cause. Mr. Speaker, I yield the floor. Thank you.
Mr. Speaker, I do thank the gentlelady for her very powerful and eloquent statement in defense of the innocent unborn child. Mr. Speaker, earlier today, an abortionist in Philadelphia, Dr. Kermit Gosnell, was arrested and charged in the death of a mother and 7 babies who were born alive but then killed by severing their spinal cords with a pair of scissors. According to the CBS TV affiliate in Philadelphia, the district attorney said that in 1 year alone, Dr. Gosnell made approximately $1.8 million performing abortions. The abortion industry, Mr. Speaker, is a multi-billion-dollar business. Planned Parenthood boasts that in 2008 alone, their abortionists killed over 324,000 babies while raking in approximately $1 billion in fees and local, state, and federal government subsidies. The ugly truth is that abortionists often get filthy rich, not by healing or nurturing or curing, but by dismembering and decapitating the fragile bodies of unborn children, by starving the child in the womb with lethal agents like RU-46, or by other means of chemical poisoning. The ugly truth is that women are victimized by abortion, wounded and hurt physically, psychologically, and emotionally. Women deserve better than abortion. The only thing the multi-billion-dollar abortion industry has produced in America and worldwide is victims. Wounded women and over 52 million dead babies in the United States alone since 1973, more than 6 times the entire population of my home state of New Jersey. The multi-billion-dollar abortion industry systematically dehumanizes the weakest and the most vulnerable among us with catchy slogans, slick advertising, clever marketing, and very aggressive lobbying, particularly here. They have made the unacceptable, to be prejudiced and bigoted against the child in the womb, acceptable to some. This acceptable bigotry has been promoted for decades despite breathtaking advances in fetal medicine, including microsurgery, underscoring the fact that an unborn child is a patient in need of care, diagnosis and care, just like anyone else, and despite the amazing window to the womb, ultrasound imaging. In 1976, Dr. Willard Cates and David Grimes, then with the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta, presented a paper to a Planned Parenthood meeting entitled, and I quote this directly, "Abortion as a Treatment for Unintended Pregnancy, the number 2 sexually transmitted disease." These 2 abortion doctors reduced the child in the womb to a disease, to a parasite, to something that had to be vanquished. As far as I know, no one at Planned Parenthood objected to this dehumanizing language and obvious bigotry towards children. Mr. Speaker, the evidence of significant harm to women who abort increases each and every year. Abortion hurts women's health and puts future children subsequently born to women who aborted at significant risk. At least 102 studies show significant psychological harm, major depression, and elevated suicide risk in women who abort. The Times of London reported that senior psychiatrists, and I quote, say that new evidence has uncovered a clear link between abortion and mental illness in women with no previous history of psychological problems. They found that, quote, women who have had abortions have twice the level of psychological problems and 3 times the level of depression as women who have given birth or who have never been pregnant. In 2006, a comprehensive New Zealand study found that almost 80% of the 15 to 18-year-olds who had abortions displayed symptoms of major depression as compared to 31% of their peers. The study also found that 27% of the 21 to 25-year-olds who had abortions had suicidal idealizations compared to 8% of those who did not have an abortion. Abortion isn't safe for subsequent children born to women who have had an abortion. And this fact is so underappreciated in the United States and really around the world. At least 113 studies show a significant association between abortion and subsequent premature births. One study by researchers Shah and Zhou showed a 36% increased risk for preterm birth after 1 abortion and a staggering 93% increased risk after 2. Same goes for low birth weight, similar percentages. So what does this mean for the children? Preterm birth is the leading cause of infant mortality in the industrialized world after congenital anomalies. Preterm infants have a greater risk from suffering chronic lung disease, sensory deficits, cerebral palsy, cognitive impairments, and behavior problems. Low birth weight is similarly associated with neonatal mortality and morbidity. Abortion causes great harm to children, to mothers. Dr. Alveda King, niece of the late Dr. Martin Luther King, who we honored just this past Monday, has joined the growing coalition of women who deeply regret their abortions and are, as they call themselves, silent no more. Out of deep personal pain and compassion for others, Dr. King, who has had 2 abortions herself, and the other women of Silent No More challenge us to respect, protect, and tangibly love both the mother and the child. The women of Silent No More give post-abortive women a safe place to grieve and a roadmap to reconciliation. This week, with the full and unequivocal support of Speaker Boehner and Majority Leader Cantor, more than 125 members and I will introduce the No Taxpayer Funding for Abortion Act, a government-wide prohibition on taxpayer subsidization for abortion and conscience protections with durable remedies. Abortion is not health care. We know that. And polls show that taxpayers strongly oppose publicly funded abortion, 67% according to a recent university poll. Our new bill is designed to end and make permanent any U.S. government financial support for abortion, whether it be direct funding or by tax credits or by any other subsidy. Regarding conscience rights, last year, Kathy DiCarlo, a nurse at Mount Sinai Hospital in New York, was compelled, despite her strong moral and religious objections, to assist in a grisly D&E abortion, which has been described by the U.S. Supreme Court as a procedure where the doctors use forceps to literally tear apart the unborn child. The child often feels pain. It's done later in pregnancy. D&E is a gruesome act of child abuse. Ms. DiCarlo sued, asserting her right to conscience had been violated under existing federal law, namely the Church Amendment. Her case was dismissed, however, due to the lack of prescribed remedies. The No Taxpayer Funding for Abortion Act protects conscience rights of individuals and institutions, entities as we call them, by empowering the courts with the authority to prevent and redress actual or threatened violations of conscience. Mr. Speaker, it is my honor to yield to my good friend and colleague, Doug Lamborn, who has been a great defender of life.
Mr. Speaker, before I begin my prepared remarks in support of life, I ask unanimous consent that Congressman Mike Ross from the state of Arkansas be removed as a co-sponsor from H.R. 68 and H.R. 69.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you. And, Mr. Speaker, I appreciate the leadership of my friend and colleague, Representative Chris Smith of New Jersey. He is such a leader in this vital area of life. We all who are pro-life in Congress look up to him. Mr. Speaker, my heart breaks when I think about the children who are now a part of a missing generation, a generation whose contributions to society we will never fully know, a generation whose lives could have inspired their families, nation, and world had they been allowed to live. Our society now discriminates against these tiny human beings who should receive the same protections as other persons. Not only does abortion strip the world of human lives, it also dramatically affects the lives of mothers, leaving them to deal with the emotional aftermath of this brutal procedure. I commend the work of pregnancy care centers across the country that provide needed services to both mothers and their children. Today, I mourn the over 50 million American lives cut short by abortion since Roe v. Wade, and pray that God continues to heal those touched by this tragic practice. I will remain steadfast in the fight for the rights and dignity of the unborn. Every human deserves the opportunity to live, and I will always fight to guard the rights of the unborn. I am dedicated to protecting the sanctity of human life from the unborn to the elderly. Like a majority in the House today, I made good on a campaign promise and voted to repeal the job-destroying health care law known as Obamacare. There were many reasons for my vote to repeal, but one of my main reasons was that the bill did not adequately protect life. You will recall President Obama signed a well-intended but ineffective executive order stating that no federal tax dollars could be used for abortions under Obamacare. We need that commitment written into law. That is what I will fight for. Tomorrow, the House will vote on a resolution directing the appropriate House committees to start working on legislation to replace Obamacare with patient-centered, common-sense reforms. Like many Americans, I want to see health care reform that, among other things, includes statutory language prohibiting taxpayer funding of abortions and provides conscience protections for health care providers. During my time in Congress, I have sponsored, co-sponsored, or supported many bills related to protecting the unborn, the family, and traditional values. One such bill I supported last Congress was H.R. 227, the Sanctity of Human Life Act, which declares that the right to life guaranteed by the Constitution is vested in each human being and that life begins at conception. I became an original co-sponsor of similar legislation, H.R. 212, which was just introduced. Additionally, I'm a member of the Values Action Team and the Pro-Life Caucus. Through these groups, I work with my pro-life colleagues in Congress to advance legislation and initiatives that support life and family. One day in the future, and I don't know how soon or how long it may take, I believe with all my heart that this country will have a renewal of respect for life, including for the unborn. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Lamborn, for your very, very fine statement. I'd like to yield now to Jean Schmidt, a gentlelady from Ohio, who I don't think there has been a single